We continue our series called Route 66. We're trying to help us to do land navigation in the Bible. That's what we said last time we studied Genesis. But I realized that that's kind of an illustration more suited to men. So I thought of one for women. Women like to shop, and when I was younger, you had to go to the mall to do that. Now you can do it on Amazon. But in the mall, you would often look at the mall map, and it would have the little circle that said, "You are here." And so you could think about this Bible survey series we're calling Route 66. It's to help you always be able to look at the mall map and see you are here. So wherever you open the Bible, hopefully by the end of the series, if you've listened to them all, you'll be able to drop into any book of the Bible and get your orientation, see where you are, see where you're going, and have a better sense of what you're reading, to read it for more benefit and more profit to yourself. Well, today, we study the book of Exodus. There have been many famous jailbreak stories in history. Escape from Alcatraz, Count of Monte Cristo, Shawshank Redemption, and of course, many others. But really, Exodus is the first jailbreak story. Genesis ends with Israel in Egypt. Some years pass, about 400 years, and a new king is over Egypt, leading the slavery of Israel, or leads to the slavery of Israel. The name of this book in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament in English, in the Septuagint and in English, is known as Exodus. That's where we get our title. Exodus means an exit or an escape. And of course, that's the need for Israel. They're in slavery in Egypt, and they need to escape and get out. God's going to deliver them from that. And so it's the ultimate jailbreak. It's the ultimate escape. And it becomes a paradigm even for God's deliverance in the future. But interestingly enough, in the Hebrew, the name of the book is different. Sometimes in the Hebrew text, the book titles are derived from the first phrase of the book. And so it is in the book of Exodus. If you look at Exodus 1:1, it says, "Now these are the names of the sons of Israel." And so the book of Exodus is actually the book of names in Hebrew. These are the names. Now, why would this be the book of names? Why is that significant? Is there anything in Exodus that would lend itself to be called the book of names? Well, actually, yes. Much to indicate that. God reveals his name in Exodus. In fact, this is the book where we get the name where God reveals himself as I am. Who is God? That's what we're asking in the book of Exodus. In chapter 3, verse 14, he reveals his name as Yahweh, I am. But notice not only that, but the emphasis on people coming to know God's name throughout the book. This actually is a theme that runs through the book. God is after people knowing his name and his glory in the book of Exodus. Just a little survey. After giving his name in chapter 3, verse 14, if you look at chapter 6, verse 7, he says, "Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out from under the hard labors of the Egyptians." Chapter 7, verse 3, we read, "But I will harden Pharaoh's heart with stiffness, that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not listen to you, and I will send my hand upon Egypt and bring out my hosts, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments. Then the Egyptians shall know that I am Yahweh, when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst." Chapter 8, verse 10. "Then he said, tomorrow, so he said, may it be according to your word, that you may know that there is no one like Yahweh our God." Chapter 9, verse 14. "For this time I will send all my plagues against your heart and amongst your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth." Verse 15. "For if by now I had sent forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, You would then have been wiped out from the earth. But indeed, for this reason I have caused you to stand, in order to show you my power and in order to recount my name through all the earth. In verse 29, and Moses said to him, as soon as I go out of the city, I will spread out my hands to Yahweh. The thunder will cease, and there will be hail no longer, that you may know that the earth is Yahweh's. Chapter 10, verse 1 and 2, just look at the end of verse 2, that you may know that I am Yahweh. Chapter 11, verse 9, you're getting the picture. Then Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my miraculous wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And of course, what will be the result? Well, they will know God's work and God's name. In chapter 14, verse 4, chapter 14, verse 4, thus I will harden Pharaoh's heart with strength, and he will pursue them, and I will be glorified through Pharaoh and all his army, so that the Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh. This just continues on and on. It does the same in verse 17, in verse 31, chapter 15, verse 11. Who is like you among the gods, O Yahweh? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, fearsome in praises, working wonders? Verses 14 to 16 as well speak of God's greatness, his name. Chapter 18, verses 8 to 11. We see there again, Jethro is praising God for who he is. So it actually worked. The deliverance that God brought about for Israel out of Egypt spread about, such that Jethro, who was not a part of Israel, heard about this, and he knew about it. So, needless to say, the Book of Names is a good title for this book. That is exactly what this book is about. God's name, God's character. And of course, if nothing else, you can't forget the expanded name of God in chapter 34, verse 6. Then Yahweh passed by in front of him, that's Moses, and called out, Yahweh, Yahweh, God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity and transgression and sin. Yet he will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, visiting the iniquity of fathers on the children and on the grandchildren to the third and fourth generations. Here, God, it gives us this great grand picture of who he is, describing himself. And that description of God gets picked up throughout the rest of the Old Testament as people describe God in that way. So we might say it like this: if you like the attributes of God, not from just a textbook, but in living color, you should read the book of Exodus, because it's going to give you lots of pictures and images of what God is like. It's going to show you in the burning bush that is not consumed, the aseity of God. He doesn't derive his being from anywhere else. He's from himself. And this fire that doesn't consume anything, but is just sustains itself, that is a great picture of who God is. He is self-sustaining. He is self-sufficient. He's the God of the plagues. And as he brings these plagues upon Egypt, he shows his authority. He shows his power. And he's the creator. We see in the tabernacle his presence with his people. In the law, that he is a God of righteousness and justice. Now, to be sure, there are other major themes in this book as well. We have the major theme of redemption or salvation and deliverance in the book. As one writer said, Exodus will show us God's signature move, or we might say his trademark. The way God delivers in Exodus, the way he delivers Israel, his people, is his trademark. It's how he's going to do it in the future. And that sets up for what he'll do later. Really, the whole concept of an Exodus will be important for the prophets later. The prophets will speak of a second Exodus in which God will deliver his people out of their future exile. And so much so that they will forget the first Exodus. In Jeremiah 23, just a sneak peek here, Jeremiah 23, verse 7, it says, "Therefore, behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when they will no longer say, as Yahweh lives, who brought up the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt, but as Yahweh lives, who brought up and brought back the seed of the household of Israel from the north land and from all the lands where I had banished them. Then they will live on their own soil. Here's the second Exodus that we're still awaiting. So the Exodus is a massive concept of God's, how he saves, how he delivers. Is so significant for the rest of the Old Testament and God's plans. Also, covenant is another theme in this book, as we get a detailed description of the giving of the Mosaic covenant. So what are some other details in this book? Well, who's the author? Well, Moses is the author, as he is the author of these first 5 books of the Bible. Moses wrote this sometime after the date of the Exodus, which the date of the Exodus is 1446 BC. 1446 BC. It's written to Israel in the plains of Moab, about to enter into the land of Canaan, promised to them. And God prepares them for this by reminding them of who their God is. Already in Exodus, God will predict that he will give them the land of Canaan. He will send his angel ahead to fight their battles, and they will take the land. And so it's going to prepare them for this God who fights for them and delivers them. So why study Exodus? Why this book? Well, maybe 2 major reasons. There could be many reasons given, but just to keep it simple, we might say that we should study Exodus to learn God's attributes and to learn God's agenda. So first, we want to learn God's attributes. It's the book of names, after all. We want to learn who God is. We want to know this great and awesome God that we worship, who is from himself, who is immutable, unchangeable, is omniscient, omnipotent. He's the creator, and he is the redeemer. We also want to learn God's agenda, his trademark, his deliverance. God's agenda is to deliver. It is salvation. And that is God's plan through and through. And we see that on full display in the book of Exodus. One person put it like this, how Exodus shows Israel's launch and what defines them, their mission, their purpose, and their identity. And what this commentator said was that really it shows us that Israel is about the God of salvation. They are all about this God who saves. Another book, Mark Dever wrote a book of Old Testament survey, and he summarized the book of Exodus in this sentence: God works sovereignly to save a special people for his own glory. All right, let's think about the outline of the book of Exodus. There's a way to outline the book that is more geographical, and it's a little bland, but it's helpful. You could think about Israel in Egypt in chapters 1 to 13, Israel in the wilderness, chapters 14 to 18, and Israel at Sinai, chapters 19 to 40, where they receive the law and the instructions for the tabernacle. But let's use an illustration that'll preach a little more, that will help us get at the message of the book a little bit more. And here, I'm actually going to borrow someone else's outline because it is so good, it's so memorable, helpful to remember, and walk yourself through the book, at least these big points. And really breaks down into 3 parts. It's from Dale Ralph Davis in his book, The Word Became Fresh, and he gives this outline for Exodus. Chapters 1 to 18 tell us about the God who delivers. The God who delivers. Then in chapters 19 to 24, we have the God who demands. The God who demands. See, first section, delivers. He gives us, shows us his delivering Israel out of Egypt. Then he gives them the law. So he demands of them based on the law. The God who delivers, chapters 19 to 24. And then finally, third section, the God who dwells. The God who dwells in chapters 25 to 40. So you got the God who delivers, the God who demands, and the God who dwells. Pretty simple, but I think it's a wonderful way to capture the basic message of this book. It is about God and is about what he does, what kind of God he is. So let's just walk through the book. And let's first start with chapters 1 to 18 and consider and worship the God who delivers. And I'm going to break this up a little bit myself into some subcategories because there's a lot of chapters to cover. So first, I want us to consider the preview of deliverance. The preview of deliverance in chapters 1 and 2. So what do we have in the beginning of Exodus? Well, Israel has been in Egypt for some time. The people are growing massively, having lots of babies. And another Pharaoh comes on the scene, and he has forgotten Joseph. And this Pharaoh is getting nervous about the growth of Israel. And this Pharaoh seeks to legalize infanticide. We see here that as they're becoming faithful, he wants them to have the midwives throw the babies into the Nile River. And so we see here, let's get a... Here we go. We see, just back up for just a moment here. One thing that's noteworthy in the beginning of chapter 1 is there's different language that takes us back to the book of Genesis. Like, for instance, verse 7, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. That's language from Genesis 1. Fruitful, increased, multiplied, land was filled. We see even language from Genesis 11, verse 3. But this is in Exodus 1, verse 10. Come, let us deal wisely with them. It's kind of Tower of Babel language. And then actually, he's having them make bricks, verse 14. And that language is used in Babel as well. Babel and bricks, right? They seek a name in Genesis 11. And here's what's interesting. He doesn't refer to him by name. He says that then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. Now, interestingly enough, the king of Egypt is not named, but these women are. And it's a way of God kind of maybe showing the insignificance of Pharaoh and the significance of these faithful women. These midwives who have been faithful to God, and that's what God prizes. In verse 17 it says the midwives feared God. And so notice what happens, verse 21. Now it happened that because the midwives feared God, he made households for them. And so we see God's blessing of them. Verse 22, and Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. And so this is the situation that we find ourselves in. But notice what happens. In chapter 2, Moses is born. This baby boy is born. And he's hidden away for 3 months. But when the mother couldn't hide him any longer, it says in verse 3, she could not hide him any longer, so she took for him an ark of papyrus reeds and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and put it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. Then we read, jump down. She's at a distance to see what happened in verse 5. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her young women walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the ark among the reeds and sent her maidservant, and she took it to her. Now I'm reading from the LSB, which brings out this idea of the ark. Where else do you hear about an ark? Well, Noah's ark. And that's this same language is being used here. It's almost like Moses has a mini ark. It's so cute. It's a baby ark to be delivered in. God delivers Noah and his family through this massive ark. Here he delivers one baby, not a man child, in this little mini ark. Now, here's what's significant. What you're going to see is that what happens to Moses is a mini picture. It's like a preview of coming attractions for what's going to happen for the entire nation of Israel. See, Moses is going to represent the people of Israel. And what you have in the Bible already established in the book of Genesis is this idea called corporate solidarity. It's the idea of one representing the many. And actually we saw that in Genesis 3:15 in that first gospel promise of the one representing the many. But here we see that Moses is going to experience, he does experience a mini deliverance. He's in this little ark, and God delivers him. And even it says he's put among the reeds. Later, we're going to hear about Israel walking through it often is the Red Sea, but actually it's a good likelihood that it's the Sea of Reeds. So that's another connection there between the deliverance of Israel and the deliverance of Moses. So we might say it like this: what happens to Moses is what happens to Israel. And someone else made this connection, which is really neat, that Moses really has a personal exodus, which is going to guarantee his people's future exodus. When you get into the New Testament, there's a lot of parallels between Moses and Jesus. And what's also interesting is that Jesus has his own little personal exodus, and Luke uses terminology that way about Jesus having his exodus. In fact, even in the Transfiguration in Luke's account, that's what they're talking about, Jesus' exodus. And his exodus guarantees his people's exodus in the future. So it's really kind of neat to see some of these biblical theological connections that are being set up for even this early in the book of Exodus. Let me just give you a few more. Think about some connections here between Moses and Jesus. In Matthew 2, Herod tries to kill baby boys, but God delivers Jesus from that. What does that sound like? It sounds like Moses and the children of Israel, the boys being Pharaoh trying to, a world leader or a ruler who's trying to kill these babies, and yet one is delivered. Moses also has this personal exodus, which is tied with Israel's exodus. And we said that about Jesus as well. Also, we're going to see more connections later. I'll save some of those for later. So what happens here? Well, Moses is delivered, and it's just so great. You got to love this story. She puts her baby in this mini ark. He floats down. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, brings him in, and she hires, of all people, to take care of Moses' mom. And so she gets paid to be his mom. This is great. So don't you love God's way of working? Well, what we see as he grows up some is that he sees some conflict going on, and it leads to Moses killing a man. After this, Moses goes into then a self-imposed exile in Midian for 40 years. He will not return until he is 80 years old. Now, Moses lives for 120 years, and you can break his life down into 40-year segments. He has 40 years in Egypt. Then he goes, after this killing this Egyptian, he goes into 40 years in exile. And then he has 40 years in leading Israel out of Egypt into the promised land. And so his public ministry doesn't even begin until he is 80 years old. He is an unlikely deliverer for Israel. But, like I said, God does in miniature for Moses what he will do for the nation. He delivers him. And notice the end of chapter 2. Is this a great passage here, 2:24 and 25. So God heard their groanings, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God knew them. When God remembers his covenant, it means he's not just calling it to mind, he's remembering so as to act. God doesn't forget anything. So this is language that says he's about to do something. And so we see here first the preview of deliverance. What's the preview? Well, in chapters 1 and 2, we see Moses delivered as a preview of coming attractions for Israel being delivered. And then we move on to chapters 3 to 11. We could call this the problems for deliverance. The problems for deliverance. The first problem is Moses. Moses in chapters 3 and 4. God reveals himself to Moses in chapter 3. And of course, this is at Mount Horeb in verse 1, the mountain of God. Later, they're going to return here, and this is where they're going to get the Ten Commandments. It says in verse 2, the angel of Yahweh appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of the bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. And God calls out to him, and he's going to use him. He says in verse 7, and Yahweh said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sufferings. And so he's going to deliver the people. Well, this leads to Moses asking a question of God. So verse 10, it says, "So now come, and I will send you to Pharaoh, and so you shall bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" And he said, "Certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God at this mountain." So they're going to be back here. Then Moses said to God, "Behold, I am about to come to the sons of Israel, and I will say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they will say to me, 'What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" In other words, this idea of like, what is his name? Maybe it's like, what is he like that he could deliver us? And so here's what God says. In verse 14, God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" This is a great name. We can't go into it, but there's so many attributes of God that are contained just in this statement of God's self-existence, his self-sufficiency, his simplicity, his all these great attributes and characteristics of God, his immutability. And so then it says, "And God furthermore said to Moses, 'Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, Yahweh, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name from generation to generation.'" And so he tells him who he is, the essence of what makes God to be God. I am. And so I got to say this quote. Abner Chou says this. He says, "The Exodus is more than just deliverance. It is also a declaration of God's name." And so God addresses Moses' objections. And even here, you got to love this. In verse 20, he says, "So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all my wondrous deeds, which I shall do in the midst of it. And after that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And it shall be that when you go, you will not go empty. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and of the woman who lives in her house for articles of silver and articles of gold and clothing. And you will put them on your sons and daughters. Thus you will plunder the Egyptians." You got to love this. God is saying, "Hey, I'm going to give you such favor in their eyes that not only will you be delivered out of this land, but they will give you their most valuable possessions. That's how I will deliver you." And so he's just giving him confidence. And so he addresses Moses' objections. Verse 1 then of chapter 4, we read, "Then Moses answered and said, 'What if they will not believe me and will not listen to my voice? For they may say, Yahweh has not appeared to you.'" So the people won't believe. That's his concern. This is interesting. The people's unbelief. What is Israel's ancestor Abraham known for? His faith. Genesis 15:6. One person put it like this, that they are anti-Abraham. And so God, his agenda for Israel requires that they be believing. This is a problem. They're not yet. They might not believe. That they may be in unbelief. In fact, Moses himself, he doesn't even circumcise his son. What's the deal, Moses? It's been pointed out Moses is acting like Pharaoh. In what way? Well, Pharaoh will not let God's son Israel go to enter into covenant with him. And Moses, by not circumcising his son, is not allowing his son to enter into covenant with God. Moses is acting like a hypocrite. So there's problems with Moses here. And this is a great observation that is not original to me. Others have pointed this out, that you already see that God does not only need to deliver them physically, but God must deliver them spiritually. He's going to deliver them out of Egypt, to be sure, physically, but they need more than that. And so that's our initial problem for deliverance is Moses and his reluctance and the people's unbelief. Another problem is Pharaoh, the king. And here in chapters 5 to 11, we're very familiar with this, and here's where we encounter the 10 plagues. And here God fights for his people. Think about like 10 rounds in a fight, in a boxing match. Now, ever wonder, why 10? Like, why not 5? Why not 1? Why not 8? Why not 50? Why 10 plagues? Well, once again, it's been observed that God spoke creation into existence with 10 sayings. And then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And that occurs 10 times. And what does that tell us? Well, he is the God over creation. And so it seems that there's a legitimate connection here as God is showing his power. He's showing who he is. He's showing, I'm the creator. I'm the sovereign. I rule over this world and this creation, and I can make it do whatever I want to do. And so just like I spoke the creation into existence in 10 sayings, so 10 times I will show my power that I'm the creator. Of course, the knockout punch is in chapter 12, verse 29. Now it happened at midnight that Yahweh struck all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of cattle. Now, this is the final blow, and they don't get up from that. These are also presented in an interesting way, which is kind of parallel with the creation account as well, setting it up as kind of like a decreation of Egypt. There are 3 sets of 3 with the plagues. So in chapter 7, verse 14, then Yahweh said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard with firmness. He refuses to let the people go. And here we see the first, second, and third plagues. And then chapter 8, verse 20. And Yahweh said, I should have read the next verse 15. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. And that's significant. That in the morning phrase is going to be repeated. So you have the first 3 in the morning. Then 8:20, and Yahweh said to Moses, rise early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh as he comes out to the water. And you may say to him, thus says Yahweh, let my people go that they may serve me. And here then we're going to see Numbers 4, 5, and 6. And then in chapter 9, verse 13, and Yahweh said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh. And you shall say to him, thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. So each time in the morning, this is connecting, I believe, to the creation week again. How God did, you have these days, these sets, even in the creation week. We also see different geography. Numbers 1 to 3 focus on water, 4 to 6 on land, 7 to 9 on skies. So lots of connections here to the creation week. God is the God who is the Lord over creation. If you want a kind of overview of the plagues, you have chapter 7, verses 1 to 13, where you can get a sense of that. Yet, really, there's more to learn as well in these plagues and what God is doing in the midst of them. Many have pointed out that these plagues are a polemic against the false gods of Egypt. And so what's happening is not only is God the true God, the creator, but he's attacking the various gods of Egypt. For instance, the god of the Nile, Happy. God attacks the Nile and it turns into blood. And so it's almost like, what happened to Happy? Well, Happy died, and now his blood is going everywhere. The second plague is upon the frogs, and this attacks their goddess over the midwives. And you're like, the midwives? Yeah. And what is happening here? It's a retribution. It's almost like God is saying, you attack my midwives, I will kill your goddess of midwives. Or think about the final plague, the 10th plague. You kill my firstborn, you kill my boys by throwing them in the Nile, I will kill your firstborn. And so this is God bringing vengeance upon them. These are all real plagues. That's important. These happen in real space-time history in Egypt. And they prepare us for the judgments in the book of Revelation even. As real judgments, but on a greater scale and scope, the whole world there. So when we get to Revelation, we see these different massive things happening upon the earth, plagues, if you will. We ought not to see those as just symbols, but actual events that are taking place on the earth. Why? Because they're parallel in some ways to what's taking place in in Exodus. Remember, this is God's signature move. This is his trademark. And so now he's going to do it again, but on a way greater scale, and leading to a greater second Exodus. I mean, it all connects. It's beautiful. And so these are real plagues setting up for how God is going to work. We also see God's sovereignty in the midst of this as he hardens Pharaoh's heart in this section to get glory for himself. This is a big focus here. In chapter 4, verse 21, we get the first kind of mention of this. It says, "And Yahweh said to Moses, when you go to return to Egypt, see to it that all the miraculous wonders which I have put in your hand, that you do them before Pharaoh. But as for me, I will harden his heart with strength, so that he will not let the people go." So the text says the Lord, here's what's interesting. There are different ways that this is spoken about. The text says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart in a number of places. Sometimes it says he hardens his own heart. Sometimes there is just a simple statement that his heart was hard. And through all of this, God also makes clear his sovereignty and that he's seeking to get glory for himself through the obstinance of Pharaoh so that he can show off in this way. And so that's a big theme there, God's sovereignty over Pharaoh and his hardening of his heart in the midst of that, and even the Egyptians as well. What's also worthy of note is that through all these plagues, God makes a distinction between the Egyptians and the Israelites. He does this a number of times throughout the plagues. Chapter 8, verse 23. Not all of them, but a good number of them. Here, this is the fourth plague, 8:23. "And I will put a division between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign will happen." Chapter 9, verse 4. "But Yahweh will make a distinction between the livestock of Israel and the livestock of Egypt, so that nothing will die of all that belongs to the sons of Israel." The same thing in verse 6. "But of the livestock of the sons of Israel, not one died." And verse 26 is the same. "Only in the land of Goshen, where the sons of Israel were, there was no hail." Chapter 11, verse 7. Notice this. This is the 10th plague is threatened, and this is this darkness. "Moreover, there shall be a great cry in all the land of Egypt, such as there has not been before, and such as shall never be again." There's just, you might say, screaming there. But notice the silence in contrast in Goshen. "But for all the sons of Israel, a dog will not even bark, whether against man or beast, that you may know how Yahweh makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." This is incredible. In chapter 12, verse 26 and 27, "And it will be when your children say to you, 'What is the meaning of this new slavery to you?' Then you will say, 'It is a Passover sacrifice to Yahweh, who passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but delivered our homes.'" And so God makes this distinction between them. I like to think about it like this. Israel today is often attacked by other places and rockets coming in, and they have this incredible sophisticated security system called the Iron Dome. And the Iron Dome seeks to shoot down rockets that are incoming. Of course, sometimes they get through, but think of Goshen as like the Iron Dome. They are protected from some of these plagues and don't experience them at all, to such a dramatic fashion that it's so evident, so apparent that God is working in a specific way against Egypt and for Israel. And yet God is still hardening Pharaoh's heart, and so it continues to go on so God can fully display what he wants to show of himself. Later on in the book, God will make a distinction between his people and all the nations by entering into covenant with them and giving them his distinguishing law. In Exodus 19, verses 4-6, which we'll look at soon. It says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel." So we see God shows his number of his signature moves for deliverance of his people: hail, locusts, darkness. You'll actually see these come up later in times of deliverance, and especially in the book of Revelation. Hail, locusts, darkness. I mean, this is how God works. This is how God delivers. You know when these things are happening that God is about to do something big, that he's delivering his people. So that's up to chapter 11 and these plagues. Then we see the Passover before deliverance in chapters 12 to 13. Chapters 12 to 13, the Passover before deliverance. And here's the famous Passover. It's the main event of the Old Testament. It's the cross of the Old Testament. It's God's picture of redemption and salvation. It's so significant that it becomes really like their July 4th, their Independence Day. And as one person put it, it shows us that there is no salvation apart from sacrifice. In the New Testament, Paul will make reference to how our Passover lamb has been sacrificed, the Lord Jesus, in 1 Corinthians 5 verse 7. One of the things that we see in the Passover is as they are preparing for it, they are told to ask for the Egyptians' possessions, and they plunder the Egyptians through this. What's interesting is that Abram plundered the Egyptians in Genesis, Isaac plundered the Egyptians, and now Israel plunders the Egyptians. And so there's this pattern going on here. God is giving them favor in their eyes, despite every reason for them to be against them. He shows favor to them, showing God's sovereignty over the hearts of the Egyptians even. So we see the Passover that takes place, and notice the intention here in chapter 12, verse 16, where we read, "Now on the first day there shall be a holy convocation, and on the seventh day there shall be a holy convocation for you. No work at all shall be done on them, except what must be eaten by every person, that alone may be done by you." The idea is you're saved unto rest. They're delivered to rest. So this is the Passover. Then in chapters 13 to 15, we see the parting for deliverance. The parting for deliverance. What do you mean the parting? The parting of the sea so that they can escape and be delivered. Now, in chapter 13, you have the setting aside of the firstborn. Chapter 14, we see that take place. And notice what it says in chapter 14, verse 14. It says, "Yahweh will fight for you, and you will keep silent." That's what Israel means, that God fights for them. And so that's what God is going to do. It's a beautiful picture. Of course, you've got Pharaoh's chasing them down, and they're kind of stuck there. But notice what happens. God fights for them. The angel of Yahweh protects them. Chapter 14, verse 19. "Then the angel of God, who had been going before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them. And the pillar of cloud moved from before them and stood behind them." Here's this angel. Who is this angel? Well, it's the angel of Yahweh. It's often a pre-incarnate manifestation of the second person of the Trinity. It's the Messiah. It's the King. It's Jesus. And he goes to protect them and deliver them. And this is a theme through Scripture, that Jesus comes to protect his people. He comes to deliver Israel and rescue them. And so he does here. He protects them and stands in the gap. Well, he delivers them. The sea is parted. They pass through on dry land. And what's the result? Well, they're going to sing of this, and they're going to rejoice in this. Verse 30 of chapter 14, "Thus Yahweh saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Then Israel saw the great hand which Yahweh had used against the Egyptians, and the people feared Yahweh, and they believed in Yahweh and in his servant Moses." Here's the response to their deliverance that they get when it seems like all hope is lost. God delivers them. Well, what happens? Well, they sing. They sing, I will sing of my Redeemer. Chapter 15, they sing the song of Moses. It's a beautiful song. And so they rejoice in that. There's even mention of the tabernacle that God is leading them towards. You see that in verse 13 and then in verse 17. That's ultimately where this is headed. Well, then we see the provisions after deliverance. So now they're delivered, they've sung, and in the end of chapter 15, really to chapter 17, you see God providing for them in the wilderness. And there's really three provisions. You have water, the end of chapter 15, and then manna and meat in chapter 16, and then water again in chapter 17. So water, manna and meat, and then water. So here's what we see. Chapters 15, 21 to 22 to 27, the end of chapter 15. This is really significant. One person said it like this: while he has taken Israel out of Egypt, he hasn't taken the Egypt out of Israel. And so despite all that God has done for the people, they wanted to return to Pharaoh, their cruel taskmaster. They've forgotten God's words and ways. And God is showing them really who they are at this point, who they really are. Now, what's interesting is in chapter 15, verses 22 to 27, God shows them the nature of his law before he gives them the law. And notice here you have this interesting statement, verse 22, that Moses set out from the Red Sea, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur. And they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And they came to Marah, but they could not drink the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. So the people grumbled at Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" Then he cried out to Yahweh, and Yahweh showed him a tree. This idea of showed is really from the word Torah. It points. The idea is the law points to something. And so here's the problem that they have. They have this bitter water, and so God shows him, he points to him, he Torahs, if you will, to a tree. And so here's the thing. He takes the tree, the branch, the tree, and he throws it in the water, and it transforms the nature of the water. Now, notice that it wasn't the pointing that changed the water. It was the tree that changed the water. That's what brought transformation. So already you're seeing this early kind of setup for what the law is going to do, or at least one thing the law is going to do. The law, by its very nature, isn't something that you can use to be saved and be transformed. No, it never was that. The Old Testament never set up for Israel to obey the law and be saved. That's never been the case. It's always been by grace. What the law does is it points you to that which does give life. And now this is quite amazing. Why does he show him a tree? Well, it's likely that this somehow connects back to the tree of life in Genesis and the Garden of Eden. And so here is the idea that the law is going to point towards that which is going to transform and give life. And so it transforms the nature of these waters and they become sweet. And so it's just this little picture before God gives the law. And we also see not only does the law point to that which gives life, but in chapter 16, they need bread, and God tests them in the wilderness there to see what their nature is by giving them manna from heaven that they must collect each day and collect extra before the Sabbath. Even though the Sabbath law has not been given yet, he's preparing them for that, to first have that. But notice what else the law does. It reveals who you are. It tests you. And this points to how the law reveals. It tests us, shows us what we're really like. And that's what we see here with Israel. We also see here God's nature to provide for his people. They are to keep some manna for the future to remember, and remember God's provision during this time. There's more opposition to Moses, and they need water again. The law is really just exposing them, revealing their utter depravity. Moses is called to strike the rock on Mount Sinai, and God will provide water, and he does that. God again shows how the law points to that which gives life. Here's the idea of like living water that they receive. And so really, we come to this toward the end of this first section here. We saw the provisions after deliverance. There's one more thing to notice in chapter 18, and we could just call it the purpose of deliverance. The purpose of deliverance. What is the purpose? What is God after here? Well, one reason is for Israel to have an international impact. And here we see Israel's fighting at the end of chapter 17 against Amalek, and Moses' arms are held up, and as his arms droop, they start to lose, and so he has the men come and hold his arms up, and as his arms are held up, then they win the battle. Well, then right after that, you have the introduction of Jethro. And there's kind of a focus here on Jethro, and notice the deliverance language that he gives. It says, "Now Jethro," verse 1, chapter 18, "the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, how Yahweh had brought Israel out of Egypt." So this guy hears about it. He's heard all about what God did. In chapter 8, Notice this, chapter 18, verse 8. And Moses recounted to his father-in-law all that Yahweh had done to Pharaoh and to the Egyptians for Israel's sake, and all the hardship that had befallen them on the journey, and how Yahweh had delivered them. And Jethro rejoiced over all the goodness which Yahweh had done to Israel, that he had delivered them from the hand of the Egyptians. So Jethro said, "Blessed be Yahweh, who delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the hand of Pharaoh, and who delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that Yahweh is greater than all the gods, for in this matter they acted presumptuously against the people." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aaron came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. This is incredible. Here's Jethro, a Gentile, who is recognizing the greatness of God based on what he's done for delivering Israel, and he's led to worship God. This is incredible. Notice the contrast between Israel and Jethro. They're complaining against God. He's confessing God. This is incredible. So what you see is the similarity of Jethro's praise, which connects Israel and Gentiles. It takes us back to Genesis 15 and the blessing that Abraham's going to have. So then Jethro begins to give Moses counsel. Moses is handling all these cases and it's becoming too much for him. So he really gives him this idea of delegating the work of disseminating the wisdom of God and the truth of God. Now, oftentimes this just gets described as like, hey, you should delegate. Don't take on too much for yourself. And yeah, that's true and good and right. But what's the real issue here? What's going on? Well, what is being disseminated? What needs to be delegated? Well, it's delegation of giving out revelation from God and truth so they know how to live and how to handle their lives and their situations. They have to be taught. And so what's really at issue here? Here's the issue. Everyone needs to know their Bible, right? I mean, there's not much of it at this point, but they all need to know the scriptures. They all need to be instructed well in the scriptures so they know how to live their lives for God. That's the idea here. And so what kind of qualities do they pick out in the men who are going to disseminate this truth? Well, they have to be competent. They have to have convictions. They have to have character. Verse 21, but you shall select excellent men out of all the people, those who fear God, men of truth, those who hate greedy gain, and you shall place these men over them as leaders of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And they will judge the people at all times, and it will be that every major matter they will bring to you, but every minor matter they themselves will judge. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. And so this is what these people need. They all need to be taught the word. They all need to learn these things, and they need to be able to live it out in all their lives. And so this is going to help facilitate that. Jethro becomes an early example of Gentile inclusion into God's promises. It's also a reminder that one can see great signs and wonders of God and yet remain in unbelief, like many of the Israelites did. And yet Jethro, here he is, who hasn't actually experienced these, but he's heard about them, and he responds and he confesses and worships God. It's a great sobering reminder that great privileges do not guarantee one is part of the true people of God. So this concludes our first section of the book. It is the God who delivers. The God who delivers. And I think this is a good place for us to stop for now. And we'll do another recording just so it doesn't get too long for our next one. But here's the God who delivers his people. This is his signature move. This is how he works. This is how he is. And it sets up for what God will do in the future. And so now they're out of Egypt. But what will happen next? Well, God is going to give them the law. He's going to make a covenant with them and on Mount Sinai. And it's going to be incredible and glorious.